Okay, hello everyone. It's 7 p.m. This Zoom session is also being recorded. So I think I'll just get started. That way we can give Frank and Mark plenty of time to go over outdoor photography. So this is the CNC Quick Start Seminar. I am Anna Liao and I organize this series along with Mike Tischer. If if any of you have any topics you'd like to give a talk to CNC, definitely feel free to contact us. Our contact info is at the bottom of this slide. And today we're going to have outdoor photography basics with Frank Brzezinski and Mark Evans. Frank has been a CNC member since 2003 and a trip leader since 2010. He is on the steering committee of the CNC photography section. His photos have been displayed at the state capitol and Denver International Airport. Mark Evans has been a CNC member since 2016 and is originally from Tennessee. His photos have won awards at the Flatirons Photo Club. So there is the link if you want to check out the photo section. And also, we just wanted to highlight some of the upcoming Pikes Peak group webinars that are coming up in April, May, and June. So definitely check those out. And then I will now hand it over to Frank.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Anna, for having us present. Just wanted to offer an invitation to everybody to come check out the photography section. You don't have to join, to just come browse around and see what we're about. Our newsletters are on the Denver website, as that previous slide mentioned, under the special interest section. And each month's topic is also on the CMC calendar. There'll be a short description of what we're going to present. And if you sign up for a meeting, right now we're still meeting in Zoom, you'll be sent the information to get into the meeting, which is the second Wednesday of every month at 7 p.m. So come join us, browse around a little bit and see what we're about. Maybe learn a little bit on a specific topic that interests you. You can preview those on the calendar, as I mentioned. I'm going to turn it over to Mark. He's going to present first.
So I'm going to talk about composition. And I'm going to start out with what's called the rule of thirds. And in the rule of thirds, you want to have your picture elements, the important picture elements like this peak right here. You want it to be on an intersection of a tic-tac-toe board. And if you have horizontal lines, and this line, ridge line, it's sort of horizontal, it's sort of not, and then there's this ridge line here. It doesn't have to be exact. That's the most important thing about rule of thirds is precision doesn't help. It's just a general principle. And it works on horizontal things. And a common element for portraiture, whether it's a portrait of an animal or a person, you typically want the eyes to be on that upper line. And you can see there's this line to this wing, and the side of the bird are on the thirds lines too. Works for squares. Main elements here being this flower and this flower and this flower. And it even works for panoramics. Now, getting back to faces, buildings have faces. And the other thing about the rule of thirds is you want any motion or direction, you want people or animals or whatever looking into the center of the picture. And the face on this building is looking out. So this is not that great a picture. same building, buildings looking into the picture. And then over here, there's even another building looking into the picture I discovered after I took it. So horizons, faces, eyes, vertical elements like trees. And this is another common problem, the bullseye shot, where the subject is kind of right in the middle of the picture because I didn't have a long enough telephoto lens to get a good picture. So the bullseye shot, not particularly desirable in most cases, but here, why is this not advancing? So I just cropped here. Let me go back and forth again. It's just cropped here and here to bring, I'm not sure if that's a sheep or a goat, but I've put it on one of the thirds points. And then this line here is along one of the thirds lines. And the animal is looking into the middle of the picture. Another dilemma for the photographer is negative space. Negatives, on the one hand, some people like negative space, but not everybody does. Negative space has to be interesting. And so here we've got this two horizons. We got this horizon line, and then we got this horizon line. And I think the snow with the dark tree background is interesting negative space. In the previous pictures, I was making the subject fill the frame. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. I'm not sure why this is not advancing. I'm not sure why it's doing that either. So here's the master of the interesting negative space, Monet. I took this picture at the Denver Art Museum. I like the Monet exhibit so much I went twice. Which leads me to another thing that I want to say is, one of my photography teachers said one time, don't look at your friends' pictures for inspiration. Their pictures are no better than yours. Go look at the old masters' paintings for inspiration. And I told that to my dad, and he said, well, the old masters of landscape are Bierstadt and Moran and Church. So I started looking for those guys' paintings, and there's a bunch of them at the Denver Art Museum and the Denver Museum of Western Art. So go there, go look at those pictures. So this is the other kind of bullseye picture. Here we've got the subject filling the frame, and this subject, the tree, is relatively symmetrical left and right. And so usually a bullseye composition of a left-right symmetrical subject works. And then there's framing. One of the problems that two-dimensional artists have is we have to take three-dimensional reality and put it into a two-dimensional work of art. And so to make it look more realistic or more engaging, if we can make it look three-dimensional, it's more engaging. And so, put half a tree on each side, or a tree overhead, or an interesting foreground, but that will give the picture depth. And then there's also the trees in the foreground, and then the forest in the midground, and then the peaks in the background. So you can see that all of these elements. And then don't be a misanthrope. Put figures in your pictures. This is my friend Steve. The picture of the mountain peaks was not that great a picture, and the picture of Steve wasn't so very good, but I'm good at Photoshop. So I put the picture of Steve in with the picture of the mountain, and he really liked it. Any questions so far? So other things that you can do to improve your pictures. Mike's Camera, I think, is a great place. They have stores in Boulder and Denver and Colorado Springs. Obviously, they should have one on the Western Slope, but they don't. But they did this workshop where they had all of these non-releasable rescued birds. And for not too much money, you could spend half a day taking close-up pictures of them, including this one that was trained to fly. And so we all had a good time. And that owl picture before, that was a captive bird too. And Mike's Camera, they're good advice, good workshops. I recommend them. Here's an example of a picture that doesn't follow the rule of thirds. And it's also, this I consider to be a landscape. And I was using this book, Photography and the Art of Seeing, which was sort of a workshop in a book to help me see things that I wouldn't necessarily see. I mean, when you're a Colorado hiker, it's pretty easy to go out there and just get bowled over by some fabulous landscape and take a picture of that. But that's easy. Getting a picture like this is a lot harder. And I'm really proud of this picture. And so I also want to suggest that you all do something, get this book, Photography and the Art of Seeing, or there's another one, Contemplative Photography. Get one of those and read it and do the exercise. It doesn't work to just read the book. Or maybe I'm sure there's other books out there too. Those are just the two that I know of. And then the other thing about this non-rule of thirds is an ebook by Ian Plant, who I think is an excellent photographer. Visual Flow, which I think is the definitive treatment on composition for nature photographers. And painters have been using, I think they call it dynamic balance. And they've been doing that for hundreds of years. But it's not something that gets taught in many photography workshops, but it should be. So that'd be a good thing to do. And then join a photography club. The Boulder has the Flatirons Photography Club, and we had a professional photographer who is a member, John Kiefer, whom some of you might know, took us out early one morning to Red Rock Lake at Brainerd Lake Recreation Area. And he knew what time of the morning to be there and exactly where to go. And we got these fabulous shots. And I've been back to this spot a bunch of times, and it's kind of crashing through the brush and the mud to get to the right spot. But as you can see, it's worth it. And I earlier said, the old masters of landscape painting. There are photographers whose work I think is worth mentioning. Ansel Adams, Art Wolfe, Tom Mangelson, who has a gallery in the Denver airport, and Ian Plant, who wrote the ebook, Galen Rowell, David Munch, John Fielder. And these guys all have websites and galleries, and they've written lots of books. And I'm gonna post some of this stuff in the comments so you all don't have to try and remember everything that I said. This to me, looks a little bit like a Bierstadt painting, if I, if I do say so myself. And this was something that I shot early in the morning at a city park in Las Vegas, a couple blocks from my hotel near the airport. So, and I had a tripod, and I knew what time sunrise was, and I knew that I was going to get up way earlier than I needed to, just because I do that. And I thought, go down the park, get a nice shot. And I think I did. And this is another one of those creative things that's not obvious. My other favorite time is when I'm car camping, before breakfast, after dinner, the so-called golden hours and blue hours. This was 100 yards from where I was, from my campsite. It's an excellent time when you're out there and you're not busy and you're not tired and you're not hiking. So take advantage of car camping. And do stuff with your pictures. You know, all of my stuff ends up on Facebook, and it's all arranged by trip or timeline, and people love my pictures, and they're very entertained by it. So I recommend that. And so the last thing I wanted to do is suggest a small camera. This is the camera that I take hiking, day hiking, and it weighs almost 2 pounds. This one weighs 300 grams and is great for backpacking. If I'm day hiking and not in a hurry, I actually take my telephoto lens too, but that's not for everybody. And then my last suggestion, when you've got something you really like, frame it, print it, hang it on the wall. If you look behind me, there's tons of pictures on the walls of my living room. People love to see it all. I love to see it all. And now let me turn it over to Frank.
Thank you, Mark.
And I will now put into the chat the stuff that I was saying in list form while Frank is going on.
Okay, we're going to try to continue on with some of these concepts in addition to composition. We'll talk a little bit about angle of view, light, weather, and timing. And from my discussion, you'll get a few, I think, pretty practical tips on how to come away with better images. How many of you have been to iconic locations like this in arches and you feel like you're getting the same photograph that the 1,000 people before you got? Well, a little bit of research in advance can help. I did that prior to this trip and discovered that there was actually a location where you could see delicate arch through another arch. It required a little scrambling, but it was worth the effort. And I had the time of day. So back to lighting. Since I was after this shot, I wanted to be there in the nice late afternoon light. Came away with something you probably don't see that often. And then I did actually leave some people in the image for scale. Many times I don't want any people in a nature photograph, but I think the folks standing next to delicate arch give you a good idea of the size of that fabulous structure. The thing you also see here up on the top of the arch I'm looking through are the cracks in the rooftop, which is how these erosion effects create these arches. Another iconic location, the Grand Canyon, very difficult place to photograph. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about pre-visualizing, or scouting, I call it. But being at a location, and I'm going to be here on this trip, we were there 4 days. And the first day I'm walking around looking at some of the highlighted locations that I saw in the guidebooks and on the maps. And I'm thinking to myself, if the light shows up the right way, this is where I want to be. So I took a photograph of this exact same location. It was flat light. It looked like thousands of other photographs taken from this overview. But one afternoon when a snowstorm came through, I knew exactly where I wanted to go. So I went out to this point. That tree had caught my interest. So as Mark had alluded to, in landscape images in particular, it's good to have a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. It gives a sense of depth. It also allows people to feel like they could actually stand on that ledge and be in the image as opposed to just the flatness of a two-dimensional scene. Thankfully, the snow highlighted that tree that I was very fond of and the ridge. And then you have some diagonal lines, these rock formations and the Tonto Plateau, all pointing to what is the main topic in my mind, which is the inner gorge of the canyon. Very difficult location to emphasize in a photograph because it's dark. Thankfully, the light was good. And you can also see the Colorado River all the way down in the bottom that carved this magnificent structure. The other fortunate thing about this photograph is the background has the clouds in it. And one of the issues that I take with a lot of Grand Canyon photographs is that flat horizon line in the back kind of detracts you from focusing on the canyon. So these clouds actually helped obscure that. So that's just an example of how at an iconic location, I go about things to get somewhat of a unique image. Don't forget to look behind you. If you see terrific light and you're enjoying a scene, turn your head around a little bit, change your perspective. Looking the other direction from where I was, there's actually a rainbow hanging out up above this battleship formation. And the harsh light, low angle light, gave some nice shadows to give you the depth of all those different ridges in the canyon, all the side canyons, as you proceed into the distance. Another thing to consider is a black and white conversion. So you could take these photographs with any camera. We use digital SLRs because we've been carrying them around. We have a lot invested in them, but there's newer, lighter cameras. So this was taken with my big camera body, but the light is really what makes the image. And I chose to convert it to black and white, but the light really highlighted that rock formation, which is Isis Temple, and the storm in the distance, the clouds. Textures are always enhanced in black and white because of the tonal range is the thing that you focus on. The other thing I liked in this location is you can actually see a good stretch of the Colorado River on the lower left. This was actually an infrared filter in Lightroom, which is a post-processing program. I could have gotten something close to this in camera. Most cameras today, even your phone, will allow you to try a monochrome image. Once again, in black and white, fairly famous iconic locations, Snake River and the Tetons. Textures are highlighted in black and white. This is also a compositional element called a leading line. So your eye enters the frame typically from the left, and the river should guide you down towards the peaks and the summer thunderstorm that was receding. So the textures are very highlighted because of the black and white nature, the ripples in the water, the peaks, and the clouds in the distance. If you have any questions, feel free to jump in. Sometimes you go out and you have a location that you're after to take a photograph, as was the case this morning. I wanted to get to the top of the ridge on Mount Falcon Park. I started out of the car and I realized that snowfall made some nice contrast with the red rock, so I changed my plan. My point here, the tip is when you see an image coming together, take the image and don't wait. I set up, we had some nice light, it was early morning, and got sort of a unique vantage point on red rocks. When I completed my hike to the top and back down, most of the snow had melted, so the image was gone. So if you see something you like, take a couple of shots, and maybe you'll get to come back later and the conditions will be better, and maybe you'll get a better shot. But take the opportunity when you first see it. That's the tip from this one. So it's talking about leading lines with the S-curve of the Snake River. There's a leading line in this photograph also, but it's a dotted line. It's these rocks that lead you to Pilot Knob. So this is a small pond near Ice Lake in the San Juan mountain range. And once again, this required scouting, but we were backpacking, so we were there for a couple of nights. And the afternoon before, we just went wandering around, looking for where we would want to be at first light, and then marking it on the GPS. That's another practical tip. If you find a location you want to come back to, whatever program you're using for navigation, you can put a waypoint in, and you can even put a note, sunrise location or sunset or whatever it is you find appealing about it. So we got up at 4:30 in the morning and we trudged over to this spot. And the reason the timing is important is as the air currents start to move, when the atmosphere heats up because of the sun, you no longer get that clear as glass reflection. So that's how this was created and why I had to get up at 4:30 in the morning. But I was celebrating my birthday, and this is what I like to do. So it was kind of a present to myself. Here's an instance of watching the light change. So this is just a day hike up on Berthoud Pass, it's a favorite route of mine. It's very nice in June. There's quite a few wildflowers up there. And I'm sitting down for lunch, and I shot this image knowing I would present it in one of our meetings or discussions. The light is really flat. It's very kind of unspectacular. But I left my camera out at my side while I'm eating lunch. So be prepared is the tip. Because as the light changed and the clouds came over the little pond, now we're not seeing the light striking the rocks at the bottom of the pond. We're seeing the reflections of the clouds. Another important tip is your main subject, if possible, should be in bright light, not in shadows. So in this case, Vasquez Peak in the background, a minute before, that cloud was on the top of the peak and it was a little less attractive of an image, because in my mind, that was one of the primary subjects. So just waiting a couple of seconds for that cloud to work its way down the peak gave me the image that I was after. I also like to shoot low. Once again, you see there's a good foreground, these marsh marigolds. The middle ground is the pond and the reflections, and then the background is the peak in the sky. Once again, scouting. This image by itself isn't bad. We had just arrived at Mirror Lake on a backpacking trip. And after we set up camp, I'll walk around and look for locations that I think I would like to come back to when the light is very nice. So I found this great little log with a new pine tree, which maybe that's a spruce growing out of the log. So it tells the story of new life. I took note of it and came back right after dinner when the light was very prime. I moved a little bit closer to the foreground element, probably about 2 feet from that little tree to emphasize it a little more, and centered Lone Eagle Peak there in some nice afternoon light. Here's an example of changing composition by moving around. I'd rather spend time in the outdoors than in front of a computer. As a matter of fact, when photography first went digital, I didn't like it because I was already in front of a computer 50 hours a week. So I try to do all these adjustments in camera when I'm in the field. I'm going to give a few examples of how I go through that process. So that way, when I look at the image later, there's very little, if anything, to do. So I'm shooting low. I'm emphasizing these flowers in the foreground. The larger yellow flowers are alpine sunflowers, sometimes called old man on the mountain. No relation to me, by the way. But there's a distracting element here, I-70, and then there's a snowboarding rail. So just by moving a little bit lower and moving to my right, I was able to eliminate those two elements. So now I don't have to go back on the computer and maybe brush something out or crop it out. I have what I was after to begin with. And
Hey,
getting a little lower yet, and
Can
a
you
little
make
bit
that
closer
full
to those
screen?
flowers helped accentuate them.
Can you make
Sometimes
that
the
full
weather,
screen, Frank? Can you make that full screen, Frank?
that's as good as we can do with what I have because Zoom uses the space bar for something else. You can zoom in on your own screen, Control plus or touch screen, make it larger. So on a day when it's overcast, what do? So you adapt. The peaks and the grand landscape may not be quite as appealing. It's a perfect time to go with macro images, or what I call the intimate landscape, something of a smaller scale. In this case, some Indian paintbrush along Arapahoe Glacier Trail up in Indian Peaks. First shot, I liked the image, but it still wasn't what I wanted. So once again, I adjusted a little bit. Having a bunch of sky in the top that was just plain white and nondescript doesn't add anything to the image. So I took it out and I emphasized the flowers a little more. And I was also able to position the tallest flower right in the middle of that snow field. It sort of brackets it and brings attention to it, I feel. So there's some practical ideas. Here's another example of this. Is still a grand landscape, but emphasizing the foreground element and then allowing for an interesting middle ground. There's somebody out on that ridge. I took a few of these. A few of them I didn't have the person, and the ridge was minimized. So I probably cut the photograph off about here because there wasn't much of interest back here. But in this particular framing, I left the middle ground intact so you can see the person enjoying the view as well as the jagged peaks of the Gore Range. We'll talk a little bit about water features. We all encounter water when we're out on the hikes. You can tell from my accent, I grew up in New York City, so I don't pronounce everything the typical way. But this waterfall is a favorite destination of mine. This shot is not so much camera agnostic. I did need a tripod to get that cotton candy effect. So it shot at about 1/8 of a second. There's a problem. That bright bush in the back is very distracting. It doesn't add anything to the photograph. It actually takes your attention away from the subject. So your main subject really should be one of the brightest, if not the brightest thing in the image. So simplify it a little bit. I changed my perspective and I went from a horizontal to a vertical composition. And we still have a little splash of sunlight right on those Indian paintbrush, but it complements the overall image. It doesn't really detract from it. The challenge with shooting water is that if it's in direct sun, you wind up with these bright highlights, that bright white in the foreground takes your attention away from things. It's kind of contrasty, busy. So there's a way to work around that. Either get there early enough that it's in the shade, or if you see a feature you like and it's in the morning and it's in the sun, chances are when you're coming down the trail in the afternoon, if it's an out and back, that slope will be in the shade. So revisit it later when the lighting is better. In this case, I'm just going to show how I adapted to this particular setting. I started here and made some intentional mistakes. I included those blown out highlights in the stream, the stick on the left that detracts you. You want to keep the edges of a photograph clean if you can, not have sort of extraneous things sitting there that don't have anything to do with the image itself. So I changed my perspective a little bit. It's getting better, but we still have a lot of those highlights. And I couldn't reach that stick. I wanted to get rid of it. So I zoomed in a little closer. And now there's no stick. And the real subject, the Paris primrose, is evident, as well as the little microclimate that they grow in under this rock. You can still tell there's moving water. You see some blue reflections in the water, but you don't have those bright highlights and harshness with the direct sun. Sometimes you can't avoid it. You're in the direct sun and you see a water feature that you like. This was kind of a backflow. So we're going to shoot in a mode that almost every camera has, even an iPhone, sports mode, where it does a quick shutter speed to freeze action. So these water droplets were frozen in midair by using 1,000th of a second shutter speed on my digital camera. But you can do the same thing with a point and shoot or many other camera bodies. I intentionally put the water droplets in front of a very dark background so that they wouldn't compete with my subject. Here's the same concept, only now in this case we had a decent foreground and background. This is a little waterfall in the San Juan range. Fast shutter speed to freeze the action. If it was a slow shutter speed or program mode, the water comes out kind of all blurry and not very appealing looking. Once again, direct sun. Anybody like to take photographs of flowers? So here we have a nice collection. However, in direct sun, there's a lot of contrast. There's a lot of highlights that aren't the flowers themselves, the rock, dirt in the background, all sorts of things going on. Kind of distracts the viewer from the image. So you can make your own shade. You can use your jacket. You can use a friend. You can wait for a cloud to come by. You can come by in the afternoon. At this case, I think I used a little reflection disc that I carry, which blocks out the sun and might let, there's different settings. You can let a little bit of light through or just make it totally dark. Much more appealing image in the shade. Compositional element, of course, it doesn't always apply, but it's just a general guideline. If you can do sets of 3s or 5s instead of just 2 blossoms, it allows the eye to explore through an image kind of in a circular fashion. So it's more engaging. If there are only 2 flowers, you would sort of bounce between the 2 and think, okay, so, but 3 or 5 gives you a chance to kind of dwell on the image and travel between the different elements in the frame. Here's a set of 5, I believe those are marsh marigolds with that topic also emphasized. Direct sun, very early morning light. So these are dewdrops on some chiming bells. And once again, I use that technique of using a very dark background to eliminate distractions. I wanted emphasis on that dewdrop that was hanging off the chiming bell. And here we have side light, which emphasizes textures. And you do get to see the little beads of water on these flowers in the early morning very clearly. Patterns in nature are a good thing to try to capture. They engage us. Here we have a repeating pattern of the mule ear flower. And then we broke the pattern with the one aster, the one purple flower. So here's looking at you. Do we have any questions? Anybody want to make a comment? Feel free in the chat box. Sometimes less is more. So this, there are a few deer following us around on Hall Ranch. And this one in particular kept looking over our way. But when you took a full body shot, you couldn't really tell that he was looking directly at me. So I just stooped down a little bit to block out most of his body. It's sort of a little more intriguing that he's looking directly at me to see what I'm up to. Critical thing in any sort of person or wildlife photography is to have sharp eyes. The image will still float if there's other parts that are maybe a little out of focus, but if the eyes are not in good focus, it won't be a pleasing photograph 9 times out of 10. being prepared for wildlife. I'm going to give a quick tip on that also. My GPS, it's an older model, but it has a hunting and fishing table. There are certain times of day and certain times of month when wildlife are more active. Typically, the new moon is a time when wildlife wasn't active during the nighttime because there was no light. So there'll be excellent viewing opportunities in the morning. You can find the same information through Google. So we went up to Waterton Canyon on a day that was rated as excellent for wildlife activity. We're going up the canyon. I see this one large ram taking a nap in the sun. He probably had a busy morning. I got the camera out. I also shoot on continuous mode whenever I'm going to shoot wildlife. So almost every device has that, and this is where you have to get to know your individual device. Continuous mode is valuable because some things happen in just an instant, particularly with animals. So coming up the roadway, I took a couple of shots. His eyes were closed. As we got fairly close to him, not that we were that close, but he probably heard our footsteps, and he raised his head just a couple inches and opened his eye. And then continuous mode, when I press the shutter, it fires off 3 or 4. As long as I keep my finger down, it'll fire off a series of images. His eye was only open for a couple of seconds. So by shooting in that manner, I got the one image where his eye was fully open. Photographs to tell a story are more engaging. Here you can actually sort of see his fur being blown back by the wind. This is on Mount Evans. The eyes are sharp, as I mentioned earlier. The hooves that allow these animals to climb around so competently on those rocks are very evident. And that was something I went up there with the intent of trying to get included in an image. And it worked. But once again, on continuous mode and a little bit of patience, when this animal moved, I got a slightly more dynamic image. When there's action in an image, it's a little more engaging. So here you can see him moving from rock to rock fairly gracefully, him or her. Quick comment on wildlife photography. Certainly for your safety, don't approach animals closely. This is with the telephoto lens, and these bison approached us on a CMC trip to Yellowstone. So we knew we were within their comfort level because they had come towards us. Sharp eyes, photo tells a story. The reason their face is covered in snow is they dig in the snow to get to the grass that sustains them through the winter. But once again, being patient and maybe waiting for something to change a little bit, the same animal from a slightly different vantage point tells a little more of a story. The thin grass that sustains them through the winter. This is another reason you don't want to get too close to them. It may not be dangerous in the winter when they're moving slow, but their margin of survival is very small. They're eating dry grass for months. So if you make them move by approaching them too closely, they're expending energy that they perhaps need to survive through the winter. So by all means, be respectful. And then back to your safety. This was in the fall in Yellowstone, and I am standing on a pickup truck bed. So I am in no danger. We are parked, and it's telephoto lens. Back to the fast shutter speed and taking a few exposures in a row. This one exposure where the animal's nostrils were large as it was inhaling was the best of a series of 4. So take a couple of extra images. Lots of times it's worth it. Any comments, questions? Okay, people in images or the shadow of my former self. I like this image. I was setting it up because of the nice leading line of our snowshoe tracks out of Shrine Mountain Inn on a snowshoe trip. My wife and I went for an afternoon, early evening walk. And as I was setting up the photo, I realized that Since the sun was low in the sky, my shadow was quite elongated. So I went with that, and I added another element in what Mark referred to earlier as negative space. But here I put something of interest in it, and we held hands to display the connection and the good time we were having on that trip. So look for different ways to integrate people into your photographs, I guess is a comment I would make. Here's your typical line them up, shoot them down type of shot. I'm going to make a few tips. This is a photo section outing up in Silverthorne. Sort of more portrait photography 101 concept, but lining people up in multiple layers so that they're not all stretched out in one thin continuous line allows their faces to be a larger part of the image and more recognizable. So here we did 2 rows based on the size of the group. And then the other tip is to not put heads right below each other, offset them a little bit. Think about triangles so that as a person looks through the group, their eye is moving kind of up, down, and over instead of just straight up and down, kind of static. This is on the end is our friend John, that Mark and I know well. He has a bright backpack. One of the nice elements of winter clothing is there's a lot of bright gear. Including some of that adds a little bit of pop to an image. So that red pack was put there intentionally to kind of add a little bit of spice as far as the color. So this is more of a people in the midst of having a good time. I put this in to illustrate how a diagonal line works a little bit better than a pure horizontal line. So the log that everybody's sitting on, I intentionally went to the end and made that a diagonal composition. It's a little more engaging and it draws you in all the way across the entire group. This is the last day of a hut trip in the San Juan range. And Judy and Ron were doing animal calls and we were laughing and having a good time. And it was just also a good composition to show people's expressions. Once again, as with the wildflowers, people photographs tend to come out a little bit better if you're not in direct sun. So bear that in mind. Muted light works a little bit better. People aren't squinting, etc. Or you can put the sun off to their side so they're not looking directly into it. Action shots are always fun, so this was pre-planned. I set up at the waterfall crossing. I got a nice angle of view that gives you the context of the waterfall itself. And then one more time, I'm shooting in continuous mode. Not 100 photographs, but 3, so that the arms and legs are in a pleasing position. As people or animals are moving, I'm sure you've seen this with birds, when their wings are in a certain setting, they look very majestic, and in another setting, they look like a little pencil going across the sky. So fire off a couple of images so you get the one that you want. This is a little bit, what would you call overdone in the Instagram era, the person staring off into the wilderness, but I like it, so I included it. And it also has a strong foreground element. Those rocks, there's a nice swoop to the line that leads up to me standing on the ridge. And the multicolored lichen. And I actually wound up with this photograph because it was on the Colorado Trail up by Searle Pass. And a thru hiker asked me to take his photograph. He saw my camera. He figured, well, maybe this guy knows what he's doing. So I had put him up here to take his photograph. He said, I have no photos of myself because I'm alone. So I put him up there and we got him a nice shot for his memory album. And when he came down, I said, I like that shot a lot. Will you take one of me? So he actually took this shot through hiker on the Colorado Trail. So framing your subject, there's a few different ways to go about this. Once again, telling a story with your photograph. This photograph tells the story of Colorado's mining heritage, even though the primary subject really is Jock's Peak in the distance. This is Mayflower Gulch. Nice side lighting across the wood on the window frame. Frames the peak nicely, directs your attention to that landscape. This is a similar setting up by Crystal Lake outside of Breckenridge. I knew someday this wall would fall down, and sure enough, a year or so afterwards, it did. So it no longer exists in this form. Once again, the mining heritage of Colorado. And to repeat myself, the brightest item in a frame hopefully is your main subject. So this is Father Dyer Peak in the background. And I waited as the clouds were rolling through. The same image with the top of the peak and the clouds is not as engaging. And then having the dappled light on the shoulder of the peak, I feel lets you know a little bit more about the topography and the geography of that magnificent location. We can use trees to frame. This is one of the few old growth forests remaining because it's in a national park. This is Crater Lake in Oregon. And I used the trees to frame Crater Lake, and of course the circular composition with the Wizard Island is what that's called, being dead center as the main point of focus. We talk a little bit about light and waiting for light to change. I mentioned that with the peak. In this case, I like this photo. We have a little trail leading up to the canoe. But that scree field in the back was awful bright. And when it was in direct sun, it competed against the image. Beautiful blue. This is Emerald Lake near Crested Butte. So I waited for a while, and when I saw clouds rolling through, having that slope in shadow doesn't distract you from the main image and the setting. Another example of a leading line, and then a little bit of context. The sign, Vasquez Peak Wilderness. Sometimes it's nice to have one of these in your collection for the day. So if you forget to label where you were and you come back to it 6 months later, you can look at one of the images and say, oh yeah, I remember that trip. Here's where I was. Photography group has a presenter every month. Our presenter last month talked about different types of lighting and using different types of imagery to enhance the type of lighting. So this was part of our assignment for this month. This was in El Dorado Canyon. A nice leading line of the fence line, which works very nicely in black and white, I feel. And the textures come out very well in the road where you can see where people have walked. Black and white allows that to be a little more of a point of focus, as well as the brightest area being these rocks, which are popular with the climbers, as many of you know or may actually climb back there. Another example from our challenge for this month to the photo group. We have the foreground, middle ground, and background, as I was emphasizing earlier. It's not always easy to do. These two trees happen to be in direct sun, so they're a nice foreground element. And they're probably related. It might be a mom and a little one. I have a good imagination. Anyhow, so that was my foreground element, and the trees behind it are very nondescript. So your eye kind of travels along that and the path out to Shark's Tooth, which is in the distance, which is nicely framed by those two tall lodgepole pines. So back to groups of three, works with people also. We were getting to the ridge, which was our destination this day. I got out a little bit ahead. As Kurt came up, he's on the left. I saw that this was coming together as a nice photo, so I took out the camera. I took one shot, and then as he got to the top, I said, hooray, we made it. Give me 5. So we got a little more expressiveness out of the participants, which made for a nice memory photo of the day. The other thing about groups is having some spacing between them. I've been bold enough sometimes on trips to ask people as they're walking down the trail if they're going to be in an image, give me 10 feet apart, because if everyone's clumped together, particularly if they're on top of each other, It's not visually appealing. It just kind of looks like a mash of humanity. So sometimes I coach people when I want a particular photo, and usually they work along with me. Because I'm semi-famous, or at least I'm a legend in my own mind. This is the photo that's at DIA, and I was honored to be selected. I think there were 4,000 entrants, and they picked 35 photographs to go up. So this was down on a CMC trip years ago to the San Juan Range. We were with Goody Gaskill, some of you may know her. She's passed now, mother of the Colorado Trail. And this is on one of our day hikes, and this is called Columbine and Sky. So I think that's everything I had. I wanted to leave a few minutes at the end for general questions. I appreciate your attention and your time.
Hi, Frank. I wanted to ask, what camera are you using when you're backpacking and hiking?
That's a great question. So I do still struggle for my art, and this particular image, I did carry a full frame DSLR, digital SLR, and I use Nikon just because they're very durable, and I'm not real gentle with my stuff. So that's the platform I've been with. If I'm out in the winter, sometimes I'll take a pocket camera like Mark was talking about. Or if it's a lengthy backpacking trip, I actually have a slightly lighter digital SLR that I'll carry. That's a Nikon D7100 that gives very good image quality, but it's quite a few ounces lighter than a D800. So I don't know if that answers your questions. It varies. And then the lens selection is another item. Someone asked earlier about picking out cameras. The trend is towards mirrorless cameras, which are lighter. So if you're shopping and looking at what you might get next, I would look in that direction.
Frank, I'm going to put my notes back up on the screen for a moment.
Okay.
Oh, and Jen also had a question in the chat about shooting, tips for shooting into the sun.
Okay, shooting into the sun, you need a lens shade, or you can use your hat. You can use a coat that somebody holds, but you don't want the distraction of the sun glare hitting your lens is the important thing. And sometimes you get beautiful backlight images going that way.
Can you guys read this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's on the
Yes.
screen. Mhm.
Mhm.
That was all I wanted, was so it'll show up on YouTube.
So I do a little bit of post-processing in Lightroom. I know Mark is also very adept at Photoshop. I don't spend more than typically a couple of minutes on an image. I don't find that as enjoyable. I try to do it right in camera. Once in a while, if I really miss something, I'll spend a little more time on it. Lightroom is very user-friendly. There's also less expensive alternatives. ON1 is a new one that's out. That's maybe $50, $60.
If anybody wants to just unmute themselves and ask a question auditorily, that's fine too.
Oh, Mark, is there something you wanted to share from your notes, or you just want to show?
Well-
I'm going to send a copy too to everyone after.
Okay,
I have
Yeah.
a question.
sure.
I'm wondering on the trail, like when I'm carrying my big Nikon and the lens and everything, like being ready to take the shot. I'm always like trying to figure out which kind of, like having it hang around my neck, of course, is really heavy. And do you have one of those movable front kind of holder things? I don't know what they're called, but how do you carry your cameras?
I have two things. I have a little plate that clamps onto my backpack strap that's made by PD Designs, and I got it at REI for $70, but it works great. And then there's a little plate, you can't see it because everything's black, that's bolted to the bottom of the camera. And so it just clips on. The other thing
Oh,
I
cool.
have is what's essentially a holster on a hip belt it's an enclosed padded case that I wear on my hip, and I can get the camera out really quickly from that. The shoulder strap thing leaves the camera exposed to rain and snow and getting smashed if I trip. But it's quick. And
Yeah.
the hip holster doesn't work when I have a backpack on with a hip belt.
Oh, okay.
The holster
Oh,
is
thanks.
what I liked the best.
The
Because
holster.
yeah, and mine is a low pro.
Oh, okay. And that's the one. Oh, okay, yeah. Well, great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Oh, I think, was that addressed the post? Oh, that's right. It was addressed, post-processing with the pictures, that question. I think that was addressed earlier.
Question, how often do you have these meetings? Is every month?
The photo section meets every month, the second Wednesday at 7 p.m.
And we know that there are lots and
you.
lots of CMC members who don't actually live near Denver. So you guys can attend the meetings by Zoom. It's an equal opportunity photo section for the time being. And we would love to have more Western Slope members.
I just want to say thank you very much. Deep gratitude for the wonderful content and just the love and passion that you've shared tonight.
Oh, you're welcome.
This was wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you as well. Really great.
Anything else?
Yeah, when things are kind of normal, are there specific photography trips that the CMC does? Or you kind of just go as a photography member on the CMC hikes?
Mostly photography on CMC hikes. The photo section does lead an occasional hike. It's sort of like herding cats, however. So we do it once in a while. You'll see it in the schedule. Feel free to jump on if you see one.
And the nice thing about photo section hikes is nobody ever tells you to hurry up.
Hey, I wondered another question. Like what I shoot with is like an 18 to 200 because it kind of gives me, I kind of just carry the one thing and do quick shots usually. So what do you all bring, like lots of lenses, or what's your?
I never bring more than two. I have my normal lens that's always on the camera, and then my telephoto lens if I don't mind the extra weight for the day's plan. But something like your lens, they're not as sharp as lenses with a narrower range, and there's and so I'm just willing to pay the price for having the extra sharpness that two lenses provides.
Oh, okay.
But lots of people like those lenses, and if you're happy with the sharpness of your picture, then keep doing it.
Yeah.
I carry, occasionally if I know I'm going to be at a spot where you get the high peaks and a lake right below it. This is ultra wide and it's kind of heavy, but that image in the San Juans, quite a few of those images were with this. It's a 12 to 24 Turkina.
That's really wide.
Oh, cool. Huh. Well, thanks.
I mean, one of the benefits of having a big, heavy, expensive camera with interchangeable lenses is you can carry more than one lens.
Yeah, I know, like take full advantage.
It's free exercise.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, great. I think I'm going to join y'all's club. I'm excited.
We'd love to have you.
Well, great. Thank you. Yeah, very, very inspiring.
Anyone else have any questions? Feel free to speak up. Okay. Thank you so much, Frank and Mark. That was such a beautiful presentation and so many great tips. We're all gonna get out there and, use those tips for our photos. And I'm sure like everyone will be excited to join the photo section group and also to join in on some trips in the future. So thank you, everyone.
Thank
Thank you, Anna.
It's recorded and I'm going to send up the notes sometime maybe next week. So yeah, and feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. Thank you so much. Really
Thank you
appreciate
so
it.
much.
Have a good evening.
Bye. Bye. You too. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Bye.
Thanks
Thank you,
for
everyone.
together.
Appreciate it.